Hi everyone, this lecture is going to be on vdL chapter 14, Truth and Wisdom. While this chapter is kind of long at times, especially the second half, he goes into sort of some long discussions of truth and wisdom and what that means. I'm really only going to focus on the first half of the chapter. For the purposes of TOK, the really important parts of this chapter are all about the three theories of truth: the correspondence theory, the coherence theory, and the pragmatic theory. So that's what I'll be focusing on. First, let's talk about the correspondence theory. The correspondence theory says that something is true if and only if it corresponds to a fact. And here, a fact is something that is real, something that you can demonstrably show in the real world. Now, what strikes me with the correspondence theory is, so something is true if it's true. And I know that it's easy to kind of look at it that way, and it makes this theory seem really kind of ridiculous. Why would we need to say, hey, it's true if and only if it's true? But I want you to try not to think that way. Think about it in terms of this. If you remember back when we were talking about common sense realism in vdL's first chapter, remember, common sense realism says that the world is real. Any object out there that I see is real, and it is the way I see it. That object exists in the form that I see it as. Now, while vdL has identified this as a sort of naive realism, and other philosophers have too, because obviously there are problems with common sense realism. Clearly, things sometimes are different from the way we see it, but on some level, it is true. Things in the world are basically how we see them. So our first impulse when trying to prove something is right is by pointing at it and saying, look, there it is. It's right there. Well, the correspondence theory says that that is a legitimate way of doing things. But of course, it has its weaknesses. First of all, we have the problem with facts. What is a fact? How do we prove what a fact is? How is a fact determined? How do we know when a fact is indeed a fact? How or where do they exist? Are facts things that exist in the world, or are they simply ideas? How do we point to a fact? These are kind of abstract, philosophical sort of questions, but they're credible and realistic questions nonetheless. Another problem is that correspondence is never perfect, largely because of language. Often, I might use a word, and other people might understand something differently from that word. Or often, I might have a certain interpretation of an item or an event, and other people might understand that item or event differently. This is a problem when we're trying to point to something and say, hey, it's like that. You see it? It exists. It's real. It's true. But if we can't agree on what the terms are, that's a problem. Also, anytime we determine truth, we're really thinking about it in a larger context. And so we're really kind of going into more the coherence theory than just correspondence. We need a bigger picture to make correspondence make sense. And so correspondence is a weaker theory in these ways. So let's go to the coherence theory. And honestly, the coherence theory is one that we use all the time. It's a constant reference point for each of us in our lives. The coherence theory says that something is true if it fits within our overall set of beliefs. Now, anytime someone gives you some sort of proposition or makes a new claim, you probably quietly think, hey, does that fit with what makes sense to me already? And that's a test that we give it. So we kind of give it the smell test, or the is this possible test. If it passes the is this possible test, then it coheres with the way we understand reality, it makes sense, and so we adopt it as true. This is particularly helpful in determining what can't be true, because if it doesn't fit in what we already think is true, then we tend to reject that idea. But there are some weaknesses here. First of all, we can come up with some pretty weird stuff and it still cohere with our reality or the way we see the world. One of the examples that vdL uses is we can have dramas about historical figures, movies about historical figures, and they can be fictionalized movies, but they make sense based on what we understand of the figure, so they cohere to our previous set of beliefs, and so we adopt them. But of course, if they didn't happen, it's not true. Also, some people have some really weird sets of beliefs, and if an idea coheres to their already really skewed set of beliefs, they can adopt it as true. So there has to be another test of truth somewhere outside the coherence theory. Also, the coherence theory can make us lazy. I already have all the answers, I already know how the world works, so why do I need to keep adding stuff or information to that way of looking at the world? We know that unfortunately lots of people adopt this kind of laziness or this sort of intellectual complacency, and I hope that as TOK students you certainly wouldn't want to do that. The final theory that I want to talk about is the pragmatic theory. Sometimes you'll hear this called the pragmatist theory. The pragmatic theory says that something is true if it, works. If it makes sense, it works in practice, it's useful to us. If something is useful and seems to work in the world, we accept it as true. This is really helpful because it helps us make predictions about the world. It also helps us think, well, last time I tried this, I approached it in this way and it seemed successful, so I'll accept that as the way to go. That's why this is called the pragmatic theory. It's reasonable and helpful to accept this as the way to go. But there are, of course, some weaknesses. First of all, and I need to add something here, useful but not true. Things can be useful but not true. They can also be true but not useful. For instance, I'm sure that many of you, I certainly do myself, we all have some unjustified levels of confidence that maybe it's very useful to believe that we are really good at something and maybe we're not quite as good as we want to believe we are. So it's useful to believe it, but that doesn't make it true. Also, it can be useful for me to believe one thing and useful for you to believe just the opposite. It can be useful for me to believe that education funding will eventually increase to a sustainable level and that will make it possible for all students to succeed. It might be useful for you to say education funding will never increase and I want it that way because my job is to come in and privatize education or whatever. In that case, we both have useful beliefs individually, but they are relative to our own perspective, and they can't both be true at the same time. Also, we have vague terms. Useful and works in practice are a bit vague. Can something be useful sometimes but not at other times, even though it's the same thing? Does that make it true sometimes and false at other times? This is really abstract and confusing and can get us in a mess. But the pragmatic theory overall is helpful in the same way that coherence is helpful. We see the world in a certain way. We have some reasons for adopting our view of the world. And if things make sense within that picture of the world, then we are more likely to say, okay, let's go with that. So the really frustrating thing about this chapter is that van der Lagenwijk points out something that we don't necessarily want to know. And that is, truth is really hard to get to sometimes. We generally take for granted that we can know the truth about most things, but what we find is that that's really hard, and that there are lots of steps to go through to get to the truth, and sometimes we might not even know that we're there. So when we reach the truth, how do we know it? How do we prove it? Now, in large part, TOK is about that very process. But one of the things that you have probably already identified is that finding the truth is harder than maybe we thought before we started the course. The next chapter is going to be, the next lesson, the next lecture, is going to be about how do we find elements of the truth that we can find, that we can prove, and we can demonstrate. So look forward to that. That'll be lecture 2 after the lecture on perception and knowing. See you soon.